Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more A Testament of Hope speeches and writings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let's go ahead and hop back into this. So, Black Power is now a part of the nomenclature of the national community. To some of to some it is abhorrent, to others dynamic. To some it is repugnant, to others exhilarating. To some it is destructive, to others it is useful. Since black power means different things to different people, and indeed being essentially an emotional concept can mean different things to the same person on differing occasions, it is impossible to attribute its ultimate meaning to any single individual or organization. One must look beyond personal styles, verbal flourishes, and the hysteria of the mass media to assess its values, its assets, and liabilities honestly. First, it is necessary to understand that Black Power is a cry of disappointment. The Black Power slogan did not spring full grown from the head of some philosophical Zeus. It was born from the wounds of despair and disappointment. It is a cry of daily hurt and persistent pain. For centuries, the Negro has been caught in the tentacles of white power. Many Negroes have given up faith in the white majority because white power with total control has left them empty handed. So, in reality, they call for black power is a reaction to the failure of white power. It is no accident that the birth of this slogan in the civil rights movement took place in Mississippi, a state symbolizing the most blatant abuse of white power. In Mississippi, the murder of civil rights workers is still a popular pastime. In that state, more than 40 Negroes and whites have either been lynched or murdered over the last 3 years, and not a single man has been punished for those crimes. More than 50 Negro churches have been burned or bombed in Mississippi in the last 2 years, yet the bombers still walk the streets surrounded by the halo of adoration. This is white power in its most brutal, cold blooded, and vicious form. Many of the young people proclaiming black power today were but yesterday the devotees of black white cooperation and nonviolent direct action. With great sacrifice and dedication and a radiant faith in the future, they labored courageously in the rural areas of the South. With idealism, they accepted blows without retaliating. With dignity, they allowed themselves to be plunged into filthy, stinking jail cells. With a majestic scorn for risk and danger, they nonviolently confronted the Jim Clarks and the Bull Connors of the South and exposed the disease of racism in the body politic. If they are America's angry children today, this anger is not congenital. It is a response to the feeling that the real solution is hopelessly distant because of the inconsistencies, resistance, and faint heartedness of those in power. If Stokely Carmichael now says that nonviolence is irrelevant, it is because he is a dedicated veteran of many battles, has seen with his own eyes the most brutal white violence against Negroes and white civil rights workers, and he has seen it go unpunished. Their frustration is further fed by the fact that when these blacks and whites die together in the cause of justice, the death of the white person gets more attention and concern than the death of the black person. Stokely and his colleagues from SNCC were with us in the Alabama when Jimmy Lee Jackson, a brave young Negro man, was killed, and when James Reeb, a committed Unitarian white minister, was fatally clubbed to the ground. They remembered how President Johnson sent flowers to the gallant Miss Reeb, and in his eloquent "We shall overcome" speech paused to mention that one person, James Reeb, had already died in the struggle. Somehow the president forgot to mention Jimmy, who died first. The parents and sister of Jimmy received no flowers from the president. The students felt this keenly, now that they felt that the death of James Reeb was less than tragic, but because they felt that the failure to mention Jimmy Jackson only reinforced the impression that to white America the life of a Negro is insignificant and meaningless. There is also great disappointment with the federal government and its timidity in implementing the civil rights law on its statute books. The gap between promise and fulfillment is distressingly wide. Millions of Negroes are frustrated and angered because of the extravagant promises made little more than a year ago are a mockery today. When the 1965 voting rights law was signed, it was proclaimed as the dawn of freedom and the open door to opportunity. What was minimally required under the law was the appointment of hundreds of registrars and thousands of federal marshals to inhibit Southern terror. Instead, fewer than 60 registrars were appointed, and not a single federal law officer capable of making arrest was sent into the South. As a consequence, the old way of life, economic coercion, terrorism, murder, and inhuman contempt has continued unabated. This gulf between the laws and their enforcement is one of the basic reasons why Black Power advocates express contempt for the legislative process. The disappointment mounts as they turn their eyes to the North. In the northern ghettos, unemployment, housing discrimination, and slum schools mock the Negro who tries to hope. These have been accomplishments and some material gain, but these beginnings have revealed how far we have yet to go. The economic plight of the masses of Negroes has worsened. The gap between the wages of the Negro worker and those of the white worker has widened. Slums are worse, and Negroes attend more thoroughly segregated schools today than in 1954. The Black Power advocates are disenchanted with the inconsistencies in the militaristic posture of our government. Over the last decade, they have seen America applauding nonviolence whenever the Negroes have practiced it. They have watched it being praised in the sit-in movements of 1960, in the Freedom Rides of 1961, in the Albany movement of 1962. in the Birmingham movement of 1963 and the Selma movement of 1965. But then these same black young men and women have watched as America sends black young men to burn Vietnamese with napalm, to slaughter men, women, and children. And they wonder what kind of nation it is that applauds nonviolence whenever Negroes face white people in the streets of the United States, but then applauds violence and burning and death with these same Negroes are sent to the fields of Vietnam. All of this represents disappointment lifted to astronomical proportions. It is a disappointment with timid white moderates who feel that they can set the timetable for the Negro's freedom. It is disappointment with the federal administration that seems to be more concerned about winning an ill-considered war in Vietnam than about winning the war against poverty here at home. It is disappointment with white legislators who pass laws in behalf of Negro rights and then never intended to implement. It is disappointment with the Christian church that appears to be more white than Christian, and many white clergymen who prefer to remain silent behind the security of stained glass windows. It is disappointment with some Negro clergymen who are more concerned about the size of the wheelbase of their automobiles than about the quality of their service in the Negro community. It is a disappointment with the Negro middle class that has sailed or struggled out of the muddy ponds into the relatively fresh flowing waters of the mainstream, and in the process has forgotten the stench of the backwaters where their brothers are still drowning. Second, Black Power is, in its broad and positive meaning, is a call to black people to amass the political and economic strength to achieve their legitimate goals. No one can deny that the Negro is in dire need of this kind of legitimate power. Indeed, one of the great problems that the Negro confronts is his lack of power, from the old plantations of the South to the newer ghettos of the North. The Negro has been confined to a life of voicelessness and powerlessness. Stripped of the right to make decisions concerning his life and destiny, he has been subject to the authoritarian and sometimes whimsical decisions of the white power structure. The plantation and the ghetto were created by those who had power both to confine and who had no power and to perpetuate their powerlessness. The problem of transforming the ghetto is, therefore, a problem of power, a confrontation between the forces of power demanding change and the forces of power dedicated to preserving the status quo. Power, properly understood, is the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, or economic changes. In this sense, is not only desirable but necessary to order uh, in order to implement the demands of love and peace. One of the greatest problems of history is that the concepts of love and peace are usually contrasted as polar opposites. Love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. It was this misinterpretation that caused Nietzsche, the philosopher of the will to power, to reject the Christian concept of love. It was this same misinterpretation which induced Christian theologians to reject Nietzsche's philosophy of the will to power in the name of the Christian idea of love. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. There is nothing essentially wrong with power. The problem is that in America, power is unequally distributed. This has led Negro Americans in the past to seek their goals through love and moral suasion devoid of power, and white Americans to seek their goal through power devoid of love and conscience. It is leading a few extremists today to advocate for Negroes the same destructive and conscienceless power that they have justly abhorred in whites. It is precisely this collision of immoral power with powerless morality which constitutes the major crisis of our times. In his struggle for racial justice, the Negro must seek to transform the condition of powerlessness into creative and positive power. One of the most obvious sources of this power is political. In Why We Can't Wait, I wrote at length of the need for Negroes to unite for political action in order to compel the majority to listen. I urge the development of political awareness and the strength in the Negro community, the election of blacks to key positions, and the use of the block vote to liberalize the political climate and achieve our just aspirations for freedom and human dignity. To the extent that Black Power advocates these goals, it is a positive and legitimate call to action that we in the civil rights movement have sought to follow all along, and which we must intensify in the future. Black Power is also a call for pooling of black financial resources to achieve economic security. While the ultimate answer to the Negro's economic dilemma will be found in a massive federal program for all the poor along the lines of A. Philip Randolph's Freedom Budget, a kind of Marshall Plan for the disadvantaged, there is something that the Negro himself can do to throw off the shackles of poverty. Although the Negro is still at the bottom of the economic ladder, his collective annual income is upwards of $30 billion. This gives him a considerable buying power that makes the difference between profit and loss in many businesses. Through the pooling of such resources and the development of habits of thrift and techniques of wise investment, the Negro will be doing his share to grapple with his problem of economic deprivation. If black power means the development of this kind of strength within the Negro community, then it is a quest for basic, necessary, legitimate power. Finally, black power is a psychological call to manhood. For years, the Negro has been taught that he is nobody, that his color is a sign of his biological depravity, and that his being has been stamped with an indelible imprint of inferiority, that his whole history has been soiled with the filth of worthlessness. All too few people realize how slavery and racial segregation have scarred the soil and wounded the spirit of the black man. The whole dirty business of slavery is based on the premise that the Negro was a thing to be used, not a person to be respected. The historian Kenneth Stampp, in his remarkable book, The Peculiar Institution, has a fascinating section on the psychological indoctrination that was necessary from the master's viewpoint to make a good slave. He gathered the material for this section primarily from the manuals and other documents which were produced by slave owners on the subject of training slaves. Stampp notes 5 recurring aspects of this training. First, those who managed the slaves had to maintain strict discipline. One master said, "Unconditional submission is the only footing upon which slavery should be placed." Another said, "The slave must know that his master is to govern absolutely and he is to obey implicitly, that he is never for a moment to exercise either his will or judgment in opposition to a positive order." Second, the masters felt that they had to implant in the bondsman a consciousness of personal inferiority. The sense of inferiority was deliberately extended to his past. The slave owners were convinced that in order to control the Negroes, the slaves had to feel that African ancestry tainted them, that their color was a badge of degradation. The third step in the training process was to all the slaves with a sense of the master's enormous power. It was necessary. Various owners said, to make them stand in fear. The fourth aspect was to attempt to persuade the bondsman to take an interest in the master's criteria of what was good and true and beautiful were to be skeptical or accepted unquestioningly by the slaves. The final step, according to Stampp's documents, was to impress Negroes with their helplessness to create in them a habit of perfect dependence upon their masters. Here, then, was the way to produce a perfect slave. Accustom them to rigid discipline. Demand from him unconditional submission. Impress upon him a sense that a sense of innate inferiority. Develop in him a paralyzing fear of the white men, train him to adopt the master's code of good behavior, and instill in him a sense of complete dependence. Out of the soul of slavery came the psychological roots of the Black Power cry. Anyone familiar with the Black Power movement recognizes that the defiance of white authority and white power is a constant theme. The defiance almost becomes a kind of taunt. Underneath it, however, there is a legitimate concern that the Negro break away from unconditional submission and thereby assert his own selfhood. Another obvious reaction to Black Power to the American system of slavery is the determination to glory in blackness and to resurrect joyously the African past. In response to the emphasis on their master's enormous power, Black Power advocates contend that the Negro must develop his own sense of strength. No longer are fear, awe, and obedience to rule. This accounts for, though it does not justify, some Black Power advocates who encourage contempt and even uncivil disobedience as alternatives to the old patterns of slavery. Black Power assumes that Negroes will be slaves unless there is a new power to counter the force of the men who are still determined to be masters rather than brothers. It is in this context of the slave tradition that some of the ideologues of the Black Power movement call for the need to develop new and indigenous codes of justice for the ghettos so that the blacks may move entirely away from their former masters' standards of good conduct. Those in the Black Power movement who contend that blacks should cut themselves off from every level of dependence upon whites for evidence or for advice, money, or other help are obviously reacting against the slave pattern of perfect dependence upon the masters. Black Power is a psychological reaction to the psychological indoctrination that led to the creation of the perfect slave. While this reaction has often led to negative and unrealistic responses and has frequently brought about intemperate words and actions, one must not overlook the positive value in calling the Negro to a new sense of manhood, to a deep feeling of racial pride, and to an audacious appreciation of his heritage. The Negro must be grasped by a new realization of his dignity and worth. He must stand up amid a system that still oppressed him and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of his own value. He must no longer be ashamed of being black. The job of arousing manhood within a people that have been taught for so many centuries that they are nobody is not easy. Even semantics are conspired to make that which the black seem ugly and degrading. In Roget's thesaurus, there are some 120 synonyms for blackness, and at least 60 of them are offensive. Such words as blot, soot, grime, devil, and foul. There are some 100 134 synonyms for whiteness, and all are favorable, expressed by words, such words as purity, cleanliness, chastity, and innocence. A white lie is better than a black lie. The most degenerate member of a family is the black sheep, not the white sheep. Ossie Davis has suggested that maybe the English language should be reconstructed so that the teachers will not be forced to teach the Negro child 60 ways to despise himself and thereby perpetuate this false sense of inferiority, and the white child 134 ways to adore himself and there perpetuate a false sense of superiority. The history books, which have almost completely ignored the contribution of the Negro in American history, have only served to intensify the Negro's sense of worthlessness and to augment the anachronistic doctrine of white supremacy. All too many Negroes and whites are unaware of the fact that the first American to shed blood in the revolution which freed this country from British oppression was a black seaman named Crispus Attucks. Negroes and whites are almost totally oblivious to the fact that it was a Negro physician, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who performed the first successful operation on the heart in America, and for developing the method of separating blood plasma and storing it on a large scale, a process that saved thousands of lives in World War II and has made possible many of the important advances in post-war medicine. History books have virtually overlooked the many Negro scientists and inventors who have encircled American life. Although a few refer to George Washington Carver, whose research in agricultural products helped to revive the economy of the South when the throne of King Cotton began to totter, they ignore the contribution of Norbert Rilliot, whose invention of an evaporating pan revolutionized the process of sugar refining. How many people know that the multi-million-dollar United Shoe Machinery Company, developed from the shoe-lasting machine invented in the last century by a Negro from Dutch Guiana, Jan Matzeliger, or that Granville T. Woods, an expert in electric motors whose many patents speeded the growth and improvement of the railroads in the beginning of the century, as a Negro. Even the Negro's contribution to the music of America is sometimes overlooked in astonishing ways. 2 years ago, my oldest son and daughter entered the integrated school in Atlanta. A few months later, my wife and I were invited to attend a program entitled Music That Has Made America Great. As the evening unfolded, we listened to the folk songs and melodies of the various immigrant people. We were certain that the program would end with the most original of all American music, the Negro spiritual. But we were mistaken. Instead, all the students, including our children, ended the program by singing Dixie. As we rose to leave the hall, my wife and I looked at each other with a combination of indignation and amazement. All the students, black and white, all the parents present that night, and the faculty members had been victimized by just another expression of America's penchant for ignoring the Negro, making him invisible and making his contributions insignificant. I wept within that night. I wept for my children and all black children who have been denied a knowledge of their heritage. I wept for all white children who, through daily miseducation, are taught that the Negro is an irrelevant entity in American society. I wept for all the white parents and teachers who are forced to overlook the fact that the wealth of cultural and technological progress in America is a result of the common wealth of inpouring contributions. The tendency to ignore the Negro's contribution to American life and strip him of his personhood is as old as the earliest books and the contemporary as the morning's newspaper. To offset this cultural homicide, the Negro must rise up with an affirmation of his own Olympian manhood. Any movement for the Negro's freedom that overlooks this necessity is only waiting to be buried. As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. Psychological freedom, a firm sense of self-esteem, is the most powerful weapon against the long night of physical slavery. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation or Kennedyan or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can totally bring this kind of freedom. The Negro will only be truly free when he reaches down to the inner depths of his own being and signs with the pen and ink of assertive selfhood his own Emancipation Proclamation, with a spirit straining toward true self-esteem. The Negro must boldly throw off the manacles of self-abnegation and say to himself and the world, I am somebody. I am a person. I am a man with dignity and honor. I have a rich and noble history, however painful and exploited that history has been. I am black and comely. This self-affirmation is the black man's need made compelling by the white man's crimes against him. This is positive and necessary power for the black people. So yes, Dr. King breaking down how he feels black power could be useful to the civil rights movement. But yeah, um, he says it to a point it can be very useful, but it must be guided and used with uh, love and restraint. It does not simply mean power as in the force that is often associated with the word. But after seeing so many politicians suggest things but it not help, implement a law, but not enforce it. Even Dr. King says there is a need that the black man needs to pull himself up. He does, but again, he does not encourage only blacks can help blacks. He believes in togetherness and help, but he wants the black man to realize that he needs uh, to also do this himself. He's not always going to have help. He's not always going to have uh, friends in the white community. So yeah, but that will be the end of this episode. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.